In the beginning, it can feel really overwhelming when you start with a new programming platform, and especially so with Java. So what can you do when you feel overwhelmed getting started? Coming up in today's episode.
Java Easy. News, tutorials, tips. Everything you need to know as a beginner Java developer.
Hi there, welcome back to the Java Easily podcast. Now, just before we get started, if it turns out that you're completely new to Java and you haven't yet grabbed your Java Beginner Starter Kit, just go over to our website at javaeasily.com and go grab it there. It's a super helpful guide. It's going to get you up and running really quickly with Java. It's completely free, and it's just a really good resource for absolute beginners to get started with Java programming. Anyway, now into the content of the episode. So in this episode, we're looking at what overwhelms beginners when they start out with Java programming. And specifically, we're kind of like looking at the fact that oftentimes beginners can get overwhelmed by all the different technology choices, all the different tools options, even using the tools and that kind of thing. So a good place to start out really is, the question, what would overwhelm beginners with respect to tooling? That is, the tools that we actually use in Java. So some questions that spring to mind. The first is, what's an IDE? How do you actually get going with an IDE? How do you begin with it? How do you get started? Things like, how do you create a project? Where do you even start? Where do you even begin? There are other things as well concerning, for example, environment variables, which are common in Java. What are environment variables? What are they used for? Do I need to do this? Is it somehow something that I can avoid? How do I set them up? How do I even know once I've set them up if I've set them up correctly? You might have other questions as well regarding satellite technologies to that kind of thing. So for example, Maven and Gradle, tools like that. Why do I even need Maven when I can actually build in an IDE anyway? What's the point of Maven? What's the point of Gradle? And that kind of thing. And these things, these kind of questions that you have when you start out, it's all like just a mishmash of noise, if you like, in your head, which oftentimes can block you from actually making progress and making the progress that you need to start getting coding with Java. I think Java, unfortunately, can feel pretty unfriendly to start out with. As we've said, we've got things like environment variables, different JDKs, setting up IDEs, that kind of weird thing where, in order to create a class or to even get some code running, you have to create a class first of all with that strange kind of public static void main method signature, which you've probably seen. And yeah, that can be a barrier as well. People can think, why do I have to create all this kind of machinery around just a simple print line to do hello world or whatever? So that can seem like a bit of a barrier as well. And all of these things can kind of hold you back, right? But they don't have to hold you back. So for example, you can install an IDE without doing all of this. So if you install IntelliJ IDEA or Eclipse, they come pre-bundled with a JDK, or you can download a specific JDK within them, and then you don't really need any setup. So you don't really necessarily have to do things like set up environment variables where you have Java_home. You don't necessarily have to set up your path and everything. That's really, when you do that kind of thing, that's really about when you're moving outside of the IDE, outside of just developing inside the IDE itself, and you're moving more towards using different tool sets. For example, using Maven or using Gradle and that kind of thing, because those tools actually need to use, or rather need to reference, the environment variables that you set up, namely Java_home, in order to locate where the JDK is and things like that. But you don't really have to do that from the outset, so don't worry. You can just download an IDE and away you go. You can get started pretty much from day one. The problem is, though, I think, is that with an IDE, even an IDE can seem pretty complex at times, certainly when you're first beginning, because even knowing how to find your way around the IDE, knowing that you have to create a class first of all, knowing that magic method signature public static void main with the array of string args which is passed into it, all that kind of stuff, and how do you even compile the program, how do you run the program once it's built, all that kind of stuff. Maybe even as well, like how do you configure a JDK if you have to use a different JDK or whatever. All this stuff really can put people off, and there's no need for it to put people off, but I can appreciate that at times it would seem quite a commitment to get started with Java. It's almost like, wow, you want me to get started with Java, but I've got to set up all these environment variables. I've got to make sure Java_home's on my path. I've got to download the IDE and everything. All I want to do, maybe you're at this stage now, all you want to do really when you start out is just to try out some commands and see how it feels. Just try out some system out print lines, try out some simple loops, maybe instantiate a class or something like java.util.date, print out the current time or whatever. Sometimes in the beginning you just want to do something, just something to get you moving from the outset. But the problem is all of the tooling and everything that goes with Java, it can be a bit of a barrier to entry, I think, to just being able to get started. So if that's the case, and if it seems that even downloading and installing an IDE is just too much, it's just a step too far, you're not really willing to make that commitment as yet, well, that's okay. You don't necessarily have to use an IDE. What you can do instead is you can use an online compiler, for example. Now you can do a search on Google for online compilers. There's quite a few available, and online compilers pop up and go away all the time. So I won't necessarily reference any on the podcast at this particular time, but just type in Java online compiler in Google and you'll come up with some sites there. Now, the idea behind a Java online compiler, or indeed any compiler for any online compiler for any other languages, the idea of that is basically that you don't actually have to install anything on your machine. So you don't have to download and install an IDE physically onto your machine itself. Instead, you just type some commands or type the Java code or whatever you want inside the browser, inside the user interface for this online compiler, and then you can hit run or build or whatever it might be, and then you can see, after a few seconds what the result would be. And what it's actually doing in the background is it's taking your code that you've inputted into the browser and it's compiling it on a JDK in the cloud and then running it on a JVM remotely in the cloud, and then just basically taking the output of what the program does and passing that back out so that you can see it in the browser. So the net effect of this is that you don't have to install anything. If you just want to, and if you're curious about Java, you just want to see if it feels okay and just try out a few commands and everything, then by all means, if an IDE or if the installation of an IDE is getting in your way and it feels like too much of a commitment, then just try things out on an online compiler and you can try some basic Java there. There's a bit of a trade-off with that though, and that's the fact that on the plus side, you don't have to put in the effort to install the IDE, okay? But the price you pay is not having the features that an IDE would give you. So for example, syntax highlighting, that's not going to be with online compilers. That's where basically it will show you or highlight the different elements of syntax in the code that you write. It will show them in different formatting to give you hints as to how the code is structured. So you don't have that. You don't have code hints as well, or for example, if you make a mistake, and you normally get that kind of squiggly underline inside an IDE, and then you can oftentimes, there's a shortcut inside IDEA or Eclipse to basically auto-correct that, or to suggest an auto-fix for that, or suggest some kind of fix for how to correct the bad syntax that you've written. You don't have that with online compilers either. Just bear that in mind, the fact that it is worth still, in my opinion, downloading and installing an IDE, because then you get all of these features completely for free and it is worth the effort, But if you're just in the position where you just want to get started with Java, see what it's like, have a bit of a play and everything, then go with an online compiler by all means. Do bear in mind that you can't create anything of real complexity or value in an online compiler by the fact that you don't have these features that we've just mentioned. But it is good to try things out, before you actually commit to installing the IDE. So that's one way of avoiding tools overwhelm, is to go with the online compiler route from the outset. Also, online compilers are actually pretty useful for professional developers as well, because of the fact that it doesn't give you any code hints, or it doesn't give you any help, and you literally have to write character for character perfect syntax in Java. That's good, because for example, you've got to put your own imports in, you don't get the squiggly red lines, so you've got to make sure that syntactically everything's correct. Oftentimes we can get a bit lazy as developers because the code will almost write itself with various templates that we invoke to produce pre-canned code templates and everything. It's also useful as well for coding interviews. So oftentimes in a coding interview, you'll have to write an algorithm out or write Java code out by hand. Sometimes even on a whiteboard. And obviously in those circumstances, you don't have the features of an IDE which make things easier. So it's good basically pre-interviews to code Java completely from scratch. You don't have to do it with an online compiler. You can also do it just in a text editor and just use Java-C to compile. But that can be useful as well, because then it really forces you to think in 100% accurate and correct syntax. So that can be useful as well, pre-interviews. So they do have a use beyond just letting beginners try out a bit of code in the browser. So what else can you do to avoid overwhelm as a beginner or tools overwhelm? Another thing you can do is you can try to do enough of something just to be able to push forward to make what I kind of term as like a mini breakthrough. Yeah, this can be like the smallest possible code unit. It can be just like a simple command or whatever it might be. But oftentimes we have this there's such a thing called complex task anxiety. Okay, it's a psychological thing, and what complex task anxiety is it's basically the anxiety that you feel, which is induced by your perception of how complex a task is to achieve or to get done. So for example, in the beginning, when you're starting out and you have to write, say, imagine you're at work and you're just starting out and you've got to write a large application or a substantial piece of code or whatever, that can oftentimes seem really daunting because of this thing called complex task anxiety. So in order to counteract that, you could really break down what you have to do into tiny little steps. So you can just do each piece of code or whatever in a baby steps kind of way. Or maybe you just need to be able to do a tiny piece of the code, which will give you just enough confidence that you know that you're moving in the right direction. yeah, sometimes that's a nice way of being able to combat this kind of overwhelmed feeling you have in the beginning. So it's really important to have these kind of mini breakthroughs. And it's even true as professionals as well. So for example, if I was, actually one time I was asked to like parse an Excel file or something. I forget the specifics of what it was at the time. So in order to do that, you do a bit of research. You say, okay, what libraries are available to be able to work with Excel files? Okay, so then you stumble across Jakarta Poi or Apache Poi, which is a library for manipulating Microsoft file types, so like PowerPoints, Excels, Word docs, that kind of stuff. But of course, initially, I don't know anything about the API that library offers. I've never used that library before. I don't know how easy it is or how difficult it's going to be. And because I'm on this side of the wall of not knowing how the API works or how the library works, it can be a bit daunting. I mean, once you get past that and you move on the other side of the wall and you've done some coding with that particular API, then everything's fine. It's a breeze then because you've assimilated that into your tool belt at that point. But prior to that, of course, it's like, you're in the world of the unknown. So how you do that is basically you have a look at the user guide, have a look at some code samples, plug the dependency into your Maven project or whatever, or download the jar file, add it to the class path, whatever it might be, and just try out a few commands. You don't have to go into every single project thinking I've got to solve the world, the whole thing for this particular application. It's much nicer, I think, much more enjoyable, and a better way of being able to get momentum quickly in the beginning is if you do this approach of just trying to have a mini breakthrough. So that can be just like creating a simple project, adding whatever library it is as a dependency, trying out a few commands, stepping through the code, setting breakpoints, and just, getting those first few baby steps along the way to give you momentum to then push forward and complete the whole kind of task. So yeah, that's an important thing as well, I think, to give you momentum. I read this thing recently I stumbled upon this thing recently on Reddit, and it was a really great phrase. I don't know who wrote it now, but the phrase was focus, concentrate, practice, and persist. And I like that. I think that's really good for beginners. You focus on something, focus as in you don't deviate your attention across multiple things, you focus on one thing. Then when you've found what you're going to focus on, you concentrate, in other words, you apply your mental brain power to understand something, then you practice. So you try things out. Maybe they don't work first time, maybe they do, maybe they're not quite right first time, but the more you practice and the more you persist with that practice, in other words, the more you keep going and you're not put off by the fact that you've got compilation errors or you're failing or you've misunderstood the API or whatever, all of that stuff, packaged together, focus, concentrate, practice, and persist. That's really the way to be able to move forward with Java, I think, and get good momentum and become a good developer. Other things you can do, as we've said, are read the Getting Started guides, Google around when you get problems, be proactive. You're never going to find a fully ingestible resource, be it a book, a website, or whatever it might be, which resonates 100% with you. In other words, teaches you the thing you want to know or presents the information you want to digest in exactly 100% compatible way for you yourself, because everyone's got different questions, everyone learns in different ways, and it's impossible really for an author of any piece of content, whether it's a course, an article, a book, or whatever, to predict the way people would learn and to be able to derive the perfect format that fits everybody. So what you really have to do, I think, is you take what you can from that resource and basically use your own research as a basis for learning. If you're going to take courses, kind of like make it your own along the way. So I always recommend taking a course, for example, in the first instance. We've got lots of courses on our website that you can have a look at, courses.javaeasily.com, and there's some good courses there. There's also some bundles you could buy as well if you want to get started with different aspects of Java technology. But the key point about courses is that you always need to make it your own. So whenever I go through a course, for example, I'm making my own notes on the material that I see. I'm reading up around the topics in addition to what's actually presented in the course. I'm setting up my own mini projects to get those kind of mini breakthroughs we spoke about before. You really have to have an active way of consuming content to make anything stick, I think. And that's really the key. So those are a few things around being overwhelmed as a beginner. So in this episode, we've looked at the feeling of being overwhelmed, and we're giving you some practical kind of tips and tricks to hopefully get you moving again. But just remember, everyone starts somewhere and you can completely do this, okay? I've got complete faith in you. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this episode. All that remains to say is thanks for listening. I hope that was helpful and have a great day ahead. Bye.